Welcome to Historian Diary. Today, I am going to tell you about a city where sex was so normalized that giant stone penises pointed the way to brothels. A place where prostitution was not hidden in dark alleys, but advertised with explicit frescoes on main streets. A city where the walls of a 2,000-year-old brothel still show graffiti from customers rating the services like ancient Yelp reviews. This is Pompeii. And on August 24, 79 Anno Domini, Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried the entire city under 20 feet of volcanic ash, perfectly preserving one of history's most complete snapshots of ancient sexuality. What makes this extraordinary is not just that we found brothels. We found price lists, customer testimonials, erotic instruction manuals painted on walls, the names of sex workers carved into stone. And what this reveals about Roman attitudes towards sex will make you question everything you think you know about sexual morality, shame, and what counts as civilized behavior. The term brothel does not capture what the Romans called a lupanar. The word comes from lupa, meaning she-wolf, which was slang for prostitute. Romans did not view prostitution as shameful or immoral. It was a regulated industry, legal, taxed, socially accepted. There was no stigma for men who used these services. Married men openly visited brothels. It was considered normal. What was shameful was not buying sex, but being penetrated. Roman sexual morality was about dominance and submission, not about monogamy or purity. If you were the penetrator, you maintained your honor regardless of your partner's gender or status. If you were penetrated, you were degraded. This mindset shaped everything about how Roman sexuality worked. My hand is trembling as I examine these archaeological records. Photographs from 1879, when Italian archaeologists first entered the Lupanar of Pompeii and found it exactly as it was the day Vesuvius erupted. Erotic frescoes still vivid on walls. Stone beds with grooves worn into them. Graffiti scratched by customers and workers. This is documented. This happened. A civilization that integrated commercial sex into daily life so thoroughly that they decorated brothels like art galleries, complete with explicit instructional paintings showing every position imaginable. And unlike most ancient history reconstructed from fragments and guesses, Pompeii gives us the actual building, the actual artwork, the actual words written by people who were there. They were not ashamed. This was business. This was culture. This was Rome. Comment below where you are watching from. Because what I am about to tell you comes from archaeological evidence, ancient Roman texts, and 250 years of excavation at Pompeii. Let me start with what happened on that day in 79 Anno Domini. Mount Vesuvius, dormant for centuries, erupted with the force of 100,000 Hiroshima bombs. The eruption column reached 20 miles into the sky. Pumice rained down on Pompeii. Buildings collapsed under the weight. People tried to flee. Then came the pyroclastic surge, a superheated cloud of gas and ash moving at 400 miles per hour. Temperature, over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Everyone in Pompeii died within 15 minutes. The city was buried under volcanic material, perfectly preserved for nearly 1,700 years. No looting, no decay, no reconstruction. Vesuvius created a time capsule. When excavations began in 1748, archaeologists discovered a city frozen in time. Bakeries with bread still in ovens. Taverns with wine amphorae on counters. Homes with meals on tables. Bodies preserved in the exact positions they died. And among all these discoveries, one building shocked even the excavators who had seen everything. The Lupanar, the main brothel of Pompeii. A 2-story building on the corner of Kualis. Unmistakably a brothel because of the explicit frescoes covering every wall. Please like this video, because what I am about to describe is how Roman commercial sex worked. and why it looked nothing like modern prostitution. The Lupanar was not hidden. It was not discreet. It was right off one of the main streets, easily accessible. Outside, on the walls of buildings throughout Pompeii, archaeologists found phallic symbols carved into stone. These were not graffiti. They were street signs pointing toward the Lupanar. Giant stone penises, some with wings, some with legs, directing customers to the brothel. Modern tourists find this shocking. Romans found it practical. The phallus was not obscene in Roman culture. It was a symbol of good luck, protection, and fertility. Having a stone penis point you toward the brothel was no more offensive than having an arrow point you toward a restaurant. The Lupanar building itself was small. Ground floor, 5 tiny rooms, each about 10 feet by 6 feet. Second floor, likely where more expensive services occurred or where the sex workers lived. Each ground floor room had a stone bed built into the wall, with a small pillow space carved into the stone. No mattresses have survived, but ancient sources mention thin cushions or just blankets on stone. Above each doorway was an erotic fresco showing a different sexual position. These were not just decoration, they were menus. Customers who did not speak Latin could point at the fresco showing what they wanted. Let me describe what these frescoes show, because they tell us everything about Roman sexual culture. One fresco shows a man and woman in missionary position. Another shows the woman on top. Another shows sex from behind. Another shows oral sex. Another shows group sex. These are not artistic nudes. These are explicit instructional diagrams. The figures are painted in vivid colors that have survived 2,000 years. The artwork is skilled, not crude. Someone with artistic training painted pornography on brothel walls, and no one considered this degrading work. It was professional decoration for a business dot inside the rooms. Archaeologists found graffiti scratched into walls by customers and sex workers. Over 120 pieces of graffiti have been documented in the Lupanar. Let me give you actual translations. One customer wrote, "Euplia was here with 2,000 beautiful men." Another wrote, "Restituta, take off your tunic and show us your hairy privates." Another, "On April 19th, I made bread and fucked at the same time." Another, "Blondie has taught me to hate dark-haired girls. I will hate them if I can, but I will fuck them regardless." These are real inscriptions preserved on real walls. Subscribe to Historian Diary if you have not already, because what these inscriptions reveal is even more interesting than the vulgarity. The graffiti includes prices. The standard price for sex at the Lupanar was 2 asses, which was about the price of a loaf of bread or a cup of cheap wine. For 2 asses, you got basic sexual service in one of those tiny stone bedrooms. More expensive services cost 8 asses or more, likely on the second floor with more skilled workers. This pricing tells us prostitution was affordable for working-class men. A laborer could visit the Lupanar on his way home from work without significant financial burden. The graffiti also includes reviews. One customer wrote, "Euplia sucks for 5 asses." Another wrote, "Athenae 2 asses." Another praised specific workers by name. One wrote, "Murtis fucks well." This is ancient Yelp. Customers left feedback. Workers built reputations. Some graffiti was written by the sex workers themselves. One wrote, "I do not want to sell to a man with bad breath." Another wrote, "Anyone who sits here should read this before anything else. If you want to fuck, ask for a tice." Price, 16 asses. Now let us talk about who these sex workers were. They were not free women choosing this profession. The vast majority were slaves. In Roman society, slaves had no legal personhood. Their bodies belonged to their owners. If your owner decided you would work in a brothel, you worked in a brothel. You had no choice. You received no wages. Your owner collected all money. Some sex workers were freed women, former slaves who had been freed but remained economically dependent on their former owners. Very few were free-born Roman women, because Roman law restricted citizen women from prostitution. The women in the Lupanar were likely slaves from conquered territories: Greece, Egypt, Germania, Britannia. They were war captives or children born to slave parents. The conditions were brutal. Those stone beds were hard, cold, and uncomfortable. The rooms were tiny, dark, and cramped. Ventilation was poor. Privacy was non-existent. Curtains hung in doorways, but provided no sound barrier. Customers and workers could hear everything happening in adjacent rooms. The women serviced multiple customers per day, possibly dozens on busy days. They had no ability to refuse customers or refuse specific acts. They had no medical care for injuries or infections. If they became pregnant, they were forced to abort, or their owner might kill the baby. Their life expectancy was short. Disease, violence, and exhaustion killed many young. Yet Roman society saw nothing wrong with this system. Prostitution was legal and regulated. Prostitutes were required to register with local authorities. They paid taxes, or their owners paid taxes on their earnings. The government collected revenue from sexual exploitation. This was not a hidden underground economy. It was official, documented, and accepted. Write in the comments. Was Roman sexual openness progressive, or was it built on slavery? Can both be true? But the Lupanar was not the only brothel in Pompeii. Archaeologists have identified at least 25 buildings that likely functioned as brothels or places where sex was sold. Some were small rooms attached to bakeries or taverns. Some were private homes where owners rented out slave women. Some were thermopolia, ancient fast food restaurants where you could buy lunch and sex. The Lupanar was just the most visible, the most official, the most specialized. Sex commerce was everywhere in Pompeii. Phallic symbols were not limited to brothel directions. They were carved above doorways as good luck charms. They were worn as pendants for protection. They were painted on shop walls. A massive stone phallus was carved into the road in front of one building. Archaeologists found a wind chime shaped like a phallus, with smaller phalli hanging from it. Romans believed the phallus protected against evil spirits. What modern culture considers obscene, Romans considered sacred. The god Priapus was depicted everywhere in Pompeii. Priapus was a fertility god, famous for his enormous permanent erection. Frescoes show Priapus weighing his gigantic penis against bags of gold, suggesting his phallus was worth its weight in money. Romans prayed to Priapus for good harvests, successful businesses, and protection from thieves. One fresco found in a Pompeii bakery shows Priapus with an erection so large he uses it as a breadboard. This was not pornography. This was religious art. But Roman sexual culture did not divide acts into moral and immoral based on who was involved. It divided acts into dominant and submissive. A Roman man could have sex with his wife, his slave, a prostitute, another man, and maintain his social standing as long as he was the active partner. What was shameful was being penetrated. A free Roman man who allowed himself to be penetrated was considered degraded, effeminate, and socially inferior. But penetrating anyone was fine. Gender did not matter. Age did not matter as long as the partner was not a free-born Roman minor. Status mattered. Power mattered. The act itself was neutral. This explains why Roman brothels were so open. If visiting prostitutes did not damage a man's reputation, why hide it? If sex was just a bodily function like eating, why not have explicit menus showing what is available? If the phallus was a symbol of power and protection, why not display it proudly? Roman sexual morality was fundamentally different from modern Western sexual morality, which is heavily influenced by Christianity. Romans had no concept of sex as sinful. They had concepts of appropriate behavior based on status and role, but not based on shame about the body or pleasure. Comment below. If Romans time traveled to modern times, would they think we are repressed or civilized? When Pompeii was excavated, the frescoes shocked the archaeologists. Early excavations in the 1700s and 1800s were conducted during highly conservative periods in European history. Victorian morality was ascendant. Christian sexual ethics dominated. The explicit artwork found in Pompeii was considered so obscene that authorities locked it away. The secret cabinet was created in the Naples Archaeological Museum, a restricted room where erotic artifacts from Pompeii were stored. Only scholars with special permission could view these items. The collection remained restricted until 2000. This tells us something important. Our ancestors were more sexually open than we are. What we consider progress towards sexual liberation, Romans would have considered repression. They would be baffled by our obsession with hiding bodies, our shame about sexuality, our laws criminalizing sex work, our insistence that sex must be private and secret. To a Roman, modern sexual morality would seem bizarre and unhealthy. But here is the critical question. Can a society be sexually open and still be deeply exploitative? Rome did not hide sex because Rome had no problem with slavery. The women in the Lupanar were enslaved. They had no freedom. Their sexual openness came at the cost of their bodily autonomy. When we look at Pompeii's brothels and think how progressive Romans were, we must also acknowledge they were only progressive for free men. For slaves, especially women, Roman sexual culture was a nightmare. Modern sex work debates often reference historical prostitution as evidence that sex work has always existed and always will. Pompeii is used as an example of how commercial sex can be integrated into society. But Pompeii was a slave society. 90% of sex workers in Pompeii were enslaved. Using Pompeii to argue for sex work normalization ignores the coercion underlying Roman prostitution. Yes, Romans were open about sex. Yes, they did not stigmatize prostitutes the way later Christian societies did. But they also enslaved the prostitutes, which is arguably worse than stigmatizing them. Thank you for watching Historian Diary. This is history that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Can sexual openness coexist with sexual exploitation? Is our culture's sexual shame a product of unnecessary repression, or does it reflect an understanding that sex involves vulnerability and power that require ethical boundaries? Are we more free than Romans or less? Here is what we know for certain. Pompeii had at least 25 brothels and sex commerce locations. The Lupanar, the main brothel, had explicit frescoes showing sexual positions, graffiti from customers and workers, and evidence of pricing. The standard price was 2 asses, equivalent to a loaf of bread. Most sex workers were slaves. The industry was legal, regulated, and taxed. Roman culture did not stigmatize sexual pleasure or commercial sex for men. Phallic symbols were ubiquitous as protective symbols. The city was destroyed on August 24, 79 Anno Domini, when Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried Pompeii under volcanic ash. Excavations beginning in 1748 revealed the city perfectly preserved. The Lupanar was discovered in the 1800s and shocked Victorian archaeologists who locked the erotic artifacts in a secret cabinet until 2000. Modern tourism to Pompeii includes visits to the Lupanar, which is one of the most popular stops. Over 2 million tourists visit Pompeii annually, and most want to see the brothel. This tells us something. We remain fascinated by sexuality. We remain shocked by openness. And we remain uncertain whether ancient sexual culture was more honest or more cruel than ours. The graffiti in the Lupanar gives us the voices of people who have been dead for 2,000 years. When someone carved Euplia sucks for 5 asses into a brothel wall in 79 Anno Domini, they could not have imagined that 2 millennia later, people would read those words and debate what they mean about human sexuality, commerce, and morality. The preservation of Pompeii means we have evidence that cannot be dismissed as exaggeration or moral panic. These are real walls, real paintings, real words, real prices, real people. Comment below and be honest. Would you rather live in sexually open Rome where slavery was normal, or sexually repressed modern West where slavery is illegal? Is that even a fair comparison? The legacy of Pompeii's brothels extends beyond archaeology. They have influenced art, literature, and debates about sexuality for 250 years. When the secret cabinet was finally opened to the public in 2000, it became one of the most visited parts of the Naples Museum. People want to see ancient erotica. People want to know how their ancestors had sex. People want to understand whether sexual shame is natural or cultural. Pornography exists in every culture and every era, but most of it is destroyed or hidden. Pompeii preserved it accidentally. The eruption created a museum of ordinary Roman life, including its sexual commerce. What we learn from Pompeii is that sexual culture is not universal. What one society considers normal, another considers obscene. Romans would be shocked by our sexual repression. We are shocked by their sexual exploitation. Both responses are valid. Both reveal values. But here is what troubles me most about the Pompeii narrative. We romanticize Roman sexual openness while ignoring Roman sexual violence. We admire their lack of shame while overlooking their lack of consent. We use Pompeii to argue that modern sexual morality is uptight, but we do not seriously consider returning to a system where sex workers are enslaved. We want the freedom without the coercion. But in Rome, they were inseparable. The Lupanar still stands today. You can visit it. You can see the frescoes, though they are faded now from 2,000 years of exposure and 250 years of tourist traffic. You can read the graffiti, though much has been worn away. You can stand in those tiny rooms where enslaved women serviced customer after customer. You can see the stone beds where they worked until they died. And you can decide for yourself, is this a monument to sexual freedom or a monument to sexual exploitation? Can it be both? Should it be preserved as history, or does preserving it celebrate something that should be condemned? These questions have no easy answers. History is not simple. The Pompeii brothels reveal a civilization that was simultaneously more sexually honest and more sexually violent than ours. They did not hide sex. They also did not free sex workers. They embraced pleasure. They also embraced slavery. They decorated brothels with art. They also forced women to work in them against their will. The eruption of Vesuvius on August 24, 79 Anno Domini killed between 10,000 and 20,000 people in Pompeii and nearby towns. Among them were the women who worked in the Lupanar. We do not know their names, except for the few mentioned in graffiti. We do not know where they came from, except that they were likely enslaved captives from conquered regions. We do not know if they tried to flee when Vesuvius erupted, or if they died in the brothel. What we know is that their labor was considered normal, their exploitation was considered legal, and their deaths were just more casualties in a disaster that buried an entire city. See you next time on Historian Diary.